80417, in a Black Valley in eastern Afghanistan, a Marine named Eli Callahan jammed his shoulder into a collapsed stone doorway and decided he was not leaving it. His rifle was dead. His radio was open. 90 seconds behind him, 4 men carried 2 casualties down a goat trail, and every one of those seconds cost him something. On a ridge above, a Navy senior chief begged 4 times for permission to turn around. 4 times a voice on the net said no. What Eli Callahan said in his last 4 seconds was recorded, sealed, and denied to his sister for 11 months. If you want to know what he said and what it cost the woman who finally heard it, subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end. And drop the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. 11 months later, Gunnery Sergeant Ren Callahan sat in an idling truck outside a coastal gate in Virginia with a manila envelope on the passenger seat, and the envelope was the reason she was there. Not the orders, not the billet. The envelope, which contained her 11th written request for a document the United States Navy had told her 11 times she was not entitled to read. She was 31 years old. She had 11 years in the Marine Corps and a black belt instructor trainer certification that fewer than 200 people in the world held, and none of it had gotten her a single unredacted page about how her brother died. So she had done what she was actually good at. She had found the angle. There was a billet. Nobody wanted lead instructor, joint close quarters integration course, 3 weeks, 30 men, half of them. SEALs who had already made it clear in writing that they did not want to be taught anything by a Marine, and especially not by a woman. 2 instructors had turned it down before it ever reached her name. The course was a political grenade with the pin already out, and the Pentagon needed somebody to hold it. Ren had volunteered inside of 6 hours, not because she believed in joint integration. She would come to believe in it later in a way that would cost her more than she was currently prepared to pay. But on that January morning, her reasoning was as cold and simple as anything she had ever done. The personnel roster for that course included the SEAL element that had been on the ridge in Afghanistan in March of 2002. She could not get the report. She could get the men. The guard at the gate took her ID, held it a beat too long, looked at her rank, looked at her face, and looked at her rank again. That was the first thing. It was always the first thing, and she had stopped resenting it years ago the way a person stops resenting weather. Gunnery Sergeant Callahan, reporting as lead instructor. He didn't say anything unprofessional. He just checked the roster twice. Captain Elias Marchetti kept her standing for exactly 4 seconds before he told her to sit, and in those 4 seconds he did something almost nobody did anymore, which was look directly at her without deciding anything. I was 58, silver-haired, slightly stooped, in a way that suggested his spine had been asked to do something once that spines are not designed to do. He ran the training center. He had signed off on her assignment personally, and she had assumed driving in that he would spend the first 10 minutes explaining to her how difficult her position was going to be. Because that was what commanders did. They told you the water was cold while they were already pushing you into it. Instead, he slid a single sheet across the desk. Read that. It was a formal objection. 2 pages dated 11 days earlier, submitted through the Naval Special Warfare chain, requesting that the joint course be conducted by a Naval Special Warfare instructor, cadre, on the grounds that Marine Corps close quarters doctrine was not operationally relevant to the element's mission profile. It did not say woman anywhere. It didn't have to. Ren had been reading documents like this since she was 22, and she had learned to hear what was underneath the grammar, the way a mechanic hears what is underneath an engine. She set it down. Understood, sir. You don't want to know who signed it. I'll meet him in 40 minutes, sir. I'd rather he tell me himself. Something moved behind Marchetti's eyes, not approval exactly, more like a man revising an estimate. He leaned back and told her the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was ugly. 3 weeks. 30 operators split roughly even between a SEAL element and a Marine infantry platoon ordered to train together for urban combat, because somebody at a very high level had looked at a map of Iraq and understood that in 6 weeks, a lot of Americans were going to be fighting inside buildings, shoulder to shoulder, with people who did not share their radio procedures or their culture or their vocabulary for the word cover. An assessment board would arrive on day 21. If the board found the course unsuccessful, joint integration training was dead for a decade. And this part, Marchetti said flatly, without softening it, every woman currently holding a combat training billet would be quietly rolled back into support roles inside of a year. because the failure would be attributed to the variable that was easiest to blame. You're not carrying 30 men, he said. You're carrying everyone who comes after you. Aware, sir. You're not aware. Nobody's aware until it's on them. He said it without cruelty. Beirut 83. I was aware of a lot of things at 0625 that morning, and none of them were the thing that actually happened at 0627. She didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. Then he did the thing that changed the shape of the next 3 weeks. He said, I knew your brother. Warren's hands did not move. Her expression did not move. She had spent 11 months building a face that did not move because for 11 months, every conversation about Eli had ended with somebody looking at her with pity and telling her the report was sealed for operational reasons. Sir, Eli Callahan came through this center in '98. He taught a breaching block for me as a favor when my instructor broke his hand. Marchetti's mouth did something complicated. He was the only man I ever met who could correct a room full of people and make all of them feel like they'd figured it out themselves. Yes, sir, that was him. I know why you volunteered. The room got very quiet. She could have denied it. She had a denial ready. She had built it in the truck, tested it, sharpened it. Personal development, career progression, a challenging billet. She looked at a 58-year-old man who had pulled bodies out of concrete for 9 days. And she understood, with the specific clarity that comes maybe 6 times in a life, that lying to him would be the most expensive thing she could possibly do. Then you know I'm not going to stop, sir. I know. Marchetti stood. So let me tell you the one thing I actually called you in here to say, and then you can go outside and put a very large man on the ground, which is what you're going to do, and don't pretend otherwise. He walked to the window without looking through it. The man who is going to fight you hardest in that compound, I want you to be careful about hating him. That's all. That's the whole speech. Why, sir? Because I've been doing this 31 years, gunnery sergeant, and in my experience, the man who fights you hardest is almost never the man who's guilty. He's the man who thinks he is. The 30 were waiting in the rain, and they had been waiting 11 minutes because Wren had made them wait 11 minutes. It was not a power move. It was information gathering. She stood where they couldn't see her, and she watched 30 men arrange themselves in the cold, and in 11 minutes, she learned more about that compound than she would have learned in 3 days of introductions. She learned that the SEAL element in the Marine platoon had formed 2 separate blocks with a gap between them wide enough to park a vehicle in, and that neither block had closed the gap and that nobody had ordered them to. She learned that a tall senior chief with a heavy dark beard, Shadow, stood at the front of the SEAL block, and that he did not talk, and that every man behind him adjusted his posture in relation to where that senior chief was standing, which meant the element's real command authority and its formal command authority were the same person, rare and much harder to work around. She learned that a thin, sandy-haired kid at the back of the SEAL block was standing about 6 inches farther from the man beside him than anybody else was standing from anybody, and that he had checked the same pouch on his kit 4 times in 11 minutes without opening it. She filed that. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it was Micah Teague, and she would learn what the pouch meant, and by then she would care about him more than she wanted to. And she learned that there was one other woman in that compound. She was standing at the edge of the Navy block, not in it, at the edge, 25 years old and explosive ordnance disposal tech. Attached to the course, 5'4", golden brown hair, pulled back in a slightly wavy ponytail that had gone dark at the ends from the rain. An olive green t-shirt soaked through and camouflage trousers bloused over her boots. Petty Officer Second Class Nadia Ruiz. She was standing at parade rest with her chin up in the posture of somebody who has learned that the only way to survive being looked at is to refuse to look away. And Wren recognized that posture the way you recognize your own handwriting. Nobody was standing within 4 feet of her. Wren walked out into the rain. She did not shout. She had learned a long time ago that shouting in front of men who have decided you are theater only confirms that you are theater. She told them her name and her billet and the length of the course, and then she told them the truth, which was that in 6 weeks, a significant number of the people standing in that formation were going to be inside buildings in a foreign city with people they had never trained with, and that the technology they trusted was going to fail. Not might would, and that when it failed, the only assets remaining would be what was in their hands and their heads in the discipline they had built before anybody was shooting at them. Then she said questions. She waited, and the gap between the two blocks sat there in the rain like a third formation. Senior Chief Roman Kovac did not step forward. That was the first thing that told her he was going to be a problem. He didn't perform. He simply spoke from where he stood in a voice that was reasonable and unhurried, and pitched exactly loud enough that all 30 men could hear every word without anybody being able to say later that he had raised his voice at an instructor. Gunnery Sergeant, genuine question, no disrespect intended. Go ahead, Senior Chief. 11 of the men behind me have done real entries in real structures with real casualties. 2 deployments, some of them 3. He let that sit. What is it exactly that a Marine Corps martial arts instructor teaches men who have already done the thing? Because I've read the program of instruction, and about 40% of it is a mat. And I want to be straight with you, I don't think anybody out here is going to say no to a woman. I think that's the problem. I think you're going to get 3 weeks of yes, ma'am, and nobody's going to learn anything, and then a board is going to write down that it worked. It was, Ren thought, with something close to professional admiration, the single most dangerous thing anyone had said to her in her career. Because it wasn't an insult, it was a point. He had said out loud the exact thing she was most afraid of, that she would be humored for 3 weeks, that the men would go through the motions out of politeness and go to Iraq unprepared, and some of them would die in a stairwell. And the last thing they'd remember about her would be that she'd been very impressive on a mat. 30 men were waiting to see whether she'd get angry. She didn't. That's a fair question, she said. Here's my answer. I'm going to ask you to step onto the mat and try to put me down. Full contact, no strikes to the face, no groin. If you succeed, I'll go to Captain Marchetti this afternoon and recommend a naval special warfare cadre run this course, and I'll sign it myself. The rain kept going. Nobody moved. And if I don't succeed, Kovac said, then everyone here stops wondering, and we get 3 weeks of work instead of 3 weeks of manners. I almost smiled. That's a hell of a bet for you to be making. It's not a bet. She said the next part quietly, and it carried anyway. And 11 months later, 2 different men would repeat it, word for word, to people who hadn't been there. Senior Chief, you can stand down right now and lose absolutely nothing. Nobody here will think less of you. I don't enjoy this part. I've done it maybe 40 times, and I've never once enjoyed it. But don't make me prove it, because once I do, you don't get to unknow it, and neither do they. Later, Ruiz would say that she had never in her life heard anyone give a man a way out that sounded so much like a countdown. Kovac took off his rain jacket and handed it to the man beside him. It took 4 seconds. Ren knew inside the first half second what he was going to do, because he was a big man who had spent 12 years being a big man successfully, and big men who have succeeded develop a signature. They close distance and they establish a grip, and they let the mathematics of mass do the rest. Kovac was better than that. He faked the grip and came in low, which was smart, and which was also the last decision he made in the engagement. She did not meet his strength. She did not have any. That was the entire foundation of everything she had built since she was 20. She moved a half step off his center line, which turned 220 pounds of forward momentum from a weapon into a liability. His right hand came through the space where her arm had been. She let it. She caught the wrist on the way past, not gripping, hooking, and rotated it 11 degrees against the radial nerve, and the entire architecture of his right arm went from an instrument to a rumor. The body follows the arm. It has to. It's not a technique, it's plumbing. Roman Kovac went down onto wet concrete on his back, and the sound of 220 pounds arriving was loud enough that a man in the second rank flinched. The compound went completely silent. It was not the silence of people being impressed. Ren had felt that silence before, and it was a warm, noisy sort of thing. This was the other one, the silence of 30 human beings, simultaneously discovering that a load-bearing wall in their understanding of the world was not in fact load-bearing. She let go of his wrist immediately. She stepped back and gave him the space to get up without an audience of her standing over him, because humiliating him would have been the stupidest tactical error available, and she had not come 300 miles to make it. Kovac lay there for about a second and a half. She could see him running it back, looking for the trick, because there is always a trick. Everybody looks for the trick. There wasn't one. That was the part that would keep him awake. He got up. He rolled his right shoulder, testing whether the arm still belonged to him. And then he did the thing that made Ren revise her entire estimate of him, because he did not get angry and he did not laugh it off and he did not look at his men. He said, again, and give me 5 of my guys. No, Ren said. No, been coming about him. She had a specific reason, and it was not showmanship. 5 men against 1 is a fight that a lucky person can win, and if she won it with 5 half, that compound would spend 3 weeks quietly telling each other that she'd gotten lucky. 8 is not luck. 8 is geometry, and geometry can be taught, and teaching it was the entire point. She told them the rules: no strikes to the face or the groin, no permanent damage. And when you tap or when your back finds the deck, you're out. She told them to coordinate to use angles to do it properly because she was not interested in beating a mob. Then she said the sentence that Micah Teague would think about for the next 3 weeks at Aero 200 in the dark, more times than he wanted to admit. And I want everybody watching to understand something before we start. I'm going to say out loud what I'm doing while I do it, every single technique. Because if you can't explain it, you can't teach it. And if you can't teach it, it dies with you. They came at her in a coordinated envelopment, and it lasted 1 minute and 51 seconds. The first one came in hard from her front, which was the mistake she had been counting on somebody making, and she did not resist him at all. She took his wrist, added to his momentum, and steered 190 pounds of United States Navy directly into the man coming from her left. They went down in a tangle. She said, "That's 2. I didn't do that. He did that. I just picked the direction." And somewhere in the Marine block, a man made a noise he immediately tried to swallow. Number 3 got a grip on her upper arm, a good grip, a controlling grip. She let him have it for a full second so that everyone could see her let him have it. Then she rotated her forearm against the weak line of his thumb, and the grip evaporated, and she folded his elbow past the angle it was designed for and held it there without weight. He slapped the concrete. She released instantly. "Grip strength is a myth," she said. "There is no such thing as a strong thumb." 4 and 5 tried to take her at the same time from opposing angles, which was actually correct, which was the first genuinely correct thing anyone had done. She swept the near man's lead leg out from under him and was already moving before he landed, because the only real currency in an 8-on-1 is that you must never be where the last man saw you. 6 went down against the fence. 7 tapped from a wrist lock he never saw arrive. And then it was Roman Kovac again, and he had spent 111 seconds studying her, and he came in low and slow and refused to commit, which meant he had learned something in less than 2 minutes that most men never learn at all. She had to work for it. That was the part that mattered, and both of them knew it. She had to work for it for 9 seconds, and at the end of the 9 seconds, she stepped inside his guard and put an open palm into his solar plexus with about 1/3 of the force available to her, and the air came out of him, and she guided him down almost gently with a hand behind his shoulder so that he arrived rather than fell. 1 minute, 51 seconds. 8 men. Nobody injured. Nobody humiliated except in the way that cannot be avoided. Ren was breathing hard. She let them see that too. She had learned that pretending not to be tired makes you a magic trick, and magic tricks don't get taught. They get watched. She helped Kovac up, and the compound was still not making any noise. And she said the only thing she'd actually come out there to say. "I want to answer your question properly, Senior Chief, because it was a good question and it deserves better than a demonstration." She turned to the whole formation in the 2 blocks where she noticed no longer quite as separate as they had been 11 minutes earlier. "I can't teach you courage. Not one of you needs it. You have all got more than I do. I can't teach you experience. 11 of you have been in rooms I've never been in, and I know it." She held up her hand. "Yeah. Here's what I can teach you. When your radio is down and your rifle is jammed and there's a man 3 feet away from you who wants you dead, your brain is going to stop. It's going to stop for 1/4 of a second or a full second or 3 seconds. And that pause is not cowardice. It's your brain trying to compute a problem it has never been given the answer to. I can't stop the pause. Nobody can. What I can do is put the answer on the other side of it 10,000 times until your hands move before your fear finishes its sentence." Nobody said anything. Because when that happens, when your hands already know something else becomes possible. And this is the actual thing. This is the only reason I'm standing in the rain instead of somewhere warm. Her voice did something then briefly that she had not authorized it to do. When your hands know what to do, you get to spend that second thinking about somebody other than yourself. That's it. That's the whole curriculum. Everything else is repetitions. 3 people in that formation did not sleep well that night for 3 completely different reasons. Micah Teague was 24 years old, and he had checked the same pouch on his kit 4 times in 11 minutes. And what was in the pouch was a folded page of a casualty card he was not supposed to still have. He had frozen once in a place he did not talk about, and the freeze had lasted somewhere between 4 and 9 seconds, depending on which version of the story he told himself at which hour of the night. And in that time, other people had made decisions that he had then had to live inside of. He had spent 11 months believing that what was wrong with him was a moral defect. And a woman in the rain had just told 30 people that the pause was not cowardice. She had said it like it was a mechanical fact, the way you'd say water boils at 212 degrees. He didn't believe her, but for the first time in 11 months, something in his chest had moved sideways, and he lay in his rack that night doing the arithmetic on whether a person could be repaired the way you repair a rifle by parts, by procedure, by somebody who knows where the springs go. Nadia Ruiz did not sleep either, and her reason was simpler and harder. She had been at that compound since October. She had eaten alone since October. She had learned to arrive at the chow hall 11 minutes after the rush and to leave before it thinned, because the middle was where the comments lived, and she had gotten very efficient at a life composed entirely of margins. She was extremely good at her job. She took apart things designed by other people to kill her, and she did it with her hands. And she had a small burn scar on her left hand that she'd earned honestly and never once explained to anybody. And she had spent 4 months being tolerated, which she had eventually understood was worse than being hated, because hatred at least concedes that you exist. She found Ren after evening chow standing alone, and she came up with her chin at that same defiant angle and the wet ponytail still dark at the ends, and she said the thing she had rehearsed on the walkover and then abandoned halfway through. Gunny, I need to ask you for something, and I don't know how to ask for it without sounding pathetic. Then sound pathetic. It's the fastest route. Ruiz's jaw worked. Train me. Separate. Before the others. After the others, I don't care about the hour. I'll take 0, 400. I'll take whatever. Her voice cracked once in the middle, and she kept going straight through it, which Ren respected enormously. I've been here 4 months, and I have not had one conversation over 2 minutes with anybody in that compound. Not one. I do my job better than they think I do, and it doesn't matter because they've already decided what I am, and nothing I do moves it. And today you moved it in 4 seconds. So please, please teach me what you did. Ren looked at a 25-year-old woman standing in the cold with her ponytail coming apart and her chin up, and felt something extremely unprofessional happen to her throat and did not let it show. No, she said. Ruiz's face did not so much fall as close. It was a practiced closing. She had clearly done it many times. Roger that, Gunny. Understood. She was already turning. Petty officer, I didn't finish. Ruiz stopped. If I train you before dawn, where nobody can see, then for the rest of your career you are a woman who got secret help. That's a story that follows you, and you will never outrun it. Ren stepped in front of her. So here's what's going to happen instead. Tomorrow at 1400, in front of all 30 of them, you are going to stand at the front of my classroom and teach the breaching mechanics block. Charge placement, standoff, structural loading. You know it better than I do and better than every man out there, and I checked your file before I got here, and you scored higher at your school than 4 of the SEALs in that formation did at theirs. Ruiz stared at her. They won't listen. They'll listen, because it's a graded block and I'm writing the evaluations. Ren's mouth moved slightly. And because after this morning, nobody in this compound is going to argue with me about who gets to stand at the front of a room. She got to Marchetti's office at 2340 because he had sent for her, and she found him standing with his back to the desk and a document on it, and she knew before he said anything that the day was not finished with her. I made a call, he said. I called in something I've been saving for 11 years, and I'm not going to tell you what it was. The envelope on the desk was thick. That is a partial release of the after-action report for the operation in which Staff Sergeant Eli Callahan was killed. 41 pages, most of it is black. The narrative section is entirely black. The communications transcript is not included, and I could not get it. He picked it up and did not immediately hand it over. Gunnery Sergeant, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to actually think before you answer, because Your answer is going to determine whether I give you this tonight or in 3 weeks. Sir, if what's in here makes it impossible for you to do your job, 30 men go to Iraq worse than they could have gone. Do you understand the trade I'm making? Ren thought about it. She made herself think about it for a full 6 seconds, which was the longest she had deliberately hesitated about anything in 11 months. Sir, I've had 11 months of not knowing, and it hasn't made me better at anything. I'll take the version where I know. He handed it to her. She read it, standing up in his office, because sitting down felt like an admission that it was going to take a while. He was right. The narrative was black. Page after page of black. Whole paragraphs reduced to prepositions. The medical annex was black. The intelligence annex did not exist. She turned pages with a steadiness that impressed her distantly, as though watching somebody else's hands. And then she reached the personnel annex, and the personnel annex was not black, because personnel annexes almost never are. They're administrative, they're boring. They're a list of names and rates and unit designations, and nobody redacts a list because nobody thinks a list can say anything. There were 9 names on the supporting element roster. She read them the way you read a list when you already know that one of them is going to be the reason your chest goes cold, top to bottom fast, and then again slower because the first pass never counts. Halfway down, Kovac R, SOK, SO1 element LDR. Ren Callahan stood in a captain's office at 10 minutes before midnight and understood 4 things in the space of about 2 seconds. That the man she had put on wet concrete 11 hours earlier had been on the ridge above her brother's doorway. That he had known who she was from the moment he read her name on the course roster. Callahan is not a common name, and he had never once looked surprised, not at the gate, not in the formation, not on the ground with his arm gone numb. That he had filed a formal written objection 11 days before she arrived, requesting that a different instructor cadre run the course, and that she had spent the entire day believing it was about her being a woman, and that Captain Elias Marchetti, who had signed the assignment personally, who had spoken exactly 1 sentence of warning all day, had known all of it before she ever walked through his door. She looked up. Marchetti was watching her the way a man watches a controlled demolition he authorized. "Sir," she said, and her voice came out level, which surprised her. "You told me to be careful about hating him." "I did." "You knew." "I knew." He didn't apologize. That was in its way the most respectful thing he could have done. "And I'm going to tell you exactly one more thing tonight, and then you're going to go get 4 hours of sleep. And tomorrow morning at 0345, you are going to run 30 men into the surf, including him, and you are going to say nothing." "Sir, nothing." Marchetti's voice did not rise. "Because in 11 days, that man asked in writing to be removed from this course. He gave a doctrinal reason. It was a lama, and I let it stand. He finally sat down and he looked every one of his 58 years. Gunnery Sergeant, I have known Roman Kovac for 6 years. In that time, I have watched him talk his way into 3 deployments he had no business taking. He does not run from anything. He has never run from anything in his life." Ren looked at the roster in her hands. "He tried to run from me. He tried to run from you." Marchetti agreed. "Now go find out why." Thought for 5s, she said nothing. That was the discipline of the next 9 days, and it cost her something every single hour. At 0345, she stood in front of 30 men in the cold and did not look at Roman Kovac any differently than she looked at anybody else. And that neutrality took more out of her than the 8-on-1 had. She ran them into the surf with 40 pounds on their backs, and she went in with them, and she came out with them. And when a Marine corporal named Prosser went down in the shallows with his legs cramping, she was the one who got under his arm and walked him out, and she did it in front of everybody, and she did not make a speech about it afterward. She had learned a long time ago that a speech is what you give when the demonstration was weak. By the 3rd day, the smirking had stopped. That was measurable. By the 5th day, the gap between the 2 blocks in the morning formation had closed to about the width of a man, which was not nothing. By the 7th day, a Navy petty officer had corrected a Marine Lance corporal's grip on a breech ram without being asked and without making it a lesson, and Ren had watched it happen from 40 feet away and felt something that was almost hope. And underneath all of it, Kovac was killing her. Not the way she had prepared for. She had prepared for insubordination, for slow walking, for the 100 quiet sabotages she had absorbed over 11 years. The man who forgets to pass along the change in the schedule, The man who asks a question he already knows the answer to in order to burn 8 minutes of instruction time. She had counters for all of it. She had been building counters since she was 22. Kovac did none of it. He arrived early. He executed every drill to standard and then above standard. He took corrections without a flicker. When she gave an instruction, he repeated it to his element in his own words within 30 seconds accurately, and his men moved. And he did it all with the exact bearing of a man completing a mandatory annual training requirement. That was the weapon. He never once said the course was worthless. He simply performed it the way you perform something that will be over soon, and 30 men read that posture off him, the way they read everything off him. And by day 6, Ren could feel it in the compound like a change in air pressure. The reps were clean and the reps were empty. Men were learning the shapes without learning the thing inside the shapes, and she knew exactly what would happen to that kind of knowledge. The first time somebody screamed at them in a stairwell in a country they'd never seen, she could not fix it with technique. There was nothing to counter. He was giving her nothing to work with, which was, she understood with a kind of furious professional respect, precisely the point. On the 6th night, she sat with the 41 redacted pages and read the personnel annex for the 9th time and thought about what it would take to say the name out loud, and she did not say it because Marchetti had been right about the trade and she was not willing to make it yet. But she started watching Kovac for something other than insubordination, and what she found was the medic. Petty Officer 2nd Class Micah Teague was on paper one of the strongest men in the compound. His marksmanship scores were excellent. His medical evaluations were excellent. He had a qualification jacket that a chief would be pleased with, and he was 24 years old, and Ren had spent 9 days watching him do something that almost nobody else would have noticed. He never went through a doorway first. Not once. Not in a single rep. He arranged himself in every stack every time so that he was 3rd or 4th or 5th, and he did it so smoothly, so casually, adjusting his position with a shift of the shoulder or a half step that looked like courtesy that the men around him had probably never registered it. He was not avoiding the door. He was managing the door 30 or 40 times a day with the constant low-grade effort of a man doing arithmetic in the background of every waking minute. Ren recognized it because she had spent 11 months arranging her own life around a doorway in Afghanistan. On the 9th day, she put the whole compound through the live shoot house. And the whole compound knew what that meant because the shoot house was where the theory stopped being theory. Real weapons live ammunition steel targets and no-shoot targets in a structure that punished hesitation with a bad angle instead of a bruise. She put Teague in a stack, and she did not put him 3rd or 4th or 5th. She put him 2nd. Afterwards, she would ask herself for a long time whether that had been instruction or cruelty. She never entirely settled it. The stack went in fast. The number 1 man broke left into the corner, which was correct, and that left the whole right side of the room to the number 2 man for approximately 1 second. And in that second, a steel target rotated up at 8 meters. Teague stopped. Not a stumble, not a flinch. He simply stopped moving in the exact center of the fatal funnel with his weapon down and his shoulders locked, and everything behind him compressed into him. The number 3 man ran into his back, and the number 4 man ran into the number 3 man, and a stack that was supposed to flow through a doorway in under 2 seconds turned into 4 human beings jammed in a gap with a live rifle pointing at the floor. The number 3 man, a SEAL named Boone, shoved him bodily out of the way and engaged. The whole thing lasted maybe 4 seconds. In a real structure, it would have been enough time to kill all 4 of them. Ren called the run cold and cleared the house and made every weapon safe before she said a single word because she had seen instructors lose control of a live fire range by opening their mouths 8 seconds too early. Teague stood outside with his rifle hanging off his sling and his face the color of paper, and he was not shaking, which was somehow worse. He had the specific stillness of somebody who has been here before and knows exactly what comes next. Boone got there first, and Boone was 26 and had adrenaline in him and no reason yet to be careful. What the hell was that, Teague? You gonna do that in Basra? You gonna stop in the door in Basra? And Roman Kovac stepped between them, and Ren watched him do it, and she watched him do it well. Weapon malfunction, Kovac said. Failure to feed. He cleared it and went. Boone, go check your own damn magazines before you audit somebody else's. It was fluent. It was delivered without a half second of hesitation. It was also completely false, and Ren was standing 11 feet away, and had watched the ejection port the entire time, and there had been no malfunction, and she knew that Kovac knew there had been no malfunction because he had been standing beside her. That night, the range log came across her desk for signature, and there it was in the senior chief's handwriting in the column for anomalies. Stack 3 run, 4 weapon stoppage corrected online, no safety violation. Wren sat with a pen over that page for 4 minutes. Signing it made her complicit in a falsified training record. Not signing it meant a formal freeze report on a Navy medic 6 weeks before an invasion, which would end with Teague pulled off the deployment roster and evaluated by people who would write the word psychological in a file that would follow him for 20 years. She signed it. Then she wrote the actual sequence verbatim, time-stamped in her personal instructor notebook, and put the notebook in her locker and lay awake. Understanding that she had just done something she had spent 11 months hating other people for doing. Somebody somewhere had made this exact calculation about her brother, that the true version was too expensive, that the clean version would serve. She had always assumed those people were cowards. It had taken her 4 minutes to become one. Teague came to her at 0206 the next morning, which she had expected, because in her experience, the ones who are going to come always come between 2 and 3. He didn't knock so much as stand in the doorway of the instructor space until she looked up. Gunny, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not write it down. Sit down, Teague. I'd rather stand. Then stand. She closed her notebook and pushed it across the desk cover down out of reach of both of them. It was a small piece of theater, and she meant every inch of it. Go. And it came out of him the way it comes out of a man who has been holding a door shut with his whole body for 11 months. He told her, he froze, that it wasn't the first time, that the first time had been in a valley in eastern Afghanistan in March of 2002, and that he had been the junior medic on a support element with 2 casualties, one of them a gut wound that was going to die if he stopped moving for 4 minutes, and that they had been ordered to keep moving down a goat trail while somebody behind them held a collapsed doorway with a rifle that wouldn't cycle. Wren did not move a muscle in her face. I never saw him, Teague said. That's the part I can't, that's the part. I never even saw the guy. I heard him on the net, and I never turned around, and my legs just kept going. And I've been trying for 11 months to figure out if I kept going because I was following orders or because my legs were relieved. What happened to the gut wound? Teague blinked. What? The casualty you were carrying? What happened to him? He lived. He said it like it was irrelevant. He's at Bragg. He's got a kid now. He stopped. His jaw came apart for a second, and he put it back together. He sent a Christmas card to all of us, and I couldn't open it. Wren was aware with a clarity that felt almost surgical that she was 11 inches away from telling this 24-year-old that the man in the doorway had been her brother. She could see the entire shape of what would happen if she did. She could see the guilt land on him and stay there. She could see him carrying it into a stairwell in Iraq in 6 weeks, and she could see exactly what a man carrying that carries it instead of. Micah, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name, and he heard it. Look at me. What's your resting heart rate? He stared. What? Your resting heart rate. 51 Gunny. You're a medic, so tell me when a man's brain gets handed a threat it's never seen before and there's no trained answer stored for it. What does the brain do? He answered automatically from a manual, because that was the part of him that still worked. Orienting response, attentional freeze, motor inhibition and then he stopped because he heard himself. While the what? While the system searches for a response, he said quietly. And what happens if the search comes back empty? It keeps searching. That's it. That's your defect. That's the whole thing you've been calling cowardice for 11 months. She let it sit for 1 beat, exactly 1. You didn't fail in that valley, Teague. You executed a search on a database that had nothing in it. And nobody had put anything in it because nobody trained you for that particular door. And the men who wrote your training pipeline are not standing here at 2 in the morning hating themselves. I promise you that. I was breathing wrong. She kept going faster now because she had about 90 seconds before he closed up again. Here's what I can do. I can't make you not freeze. I've never been able to teach that to anybody, and I don't believe the people who claim they can. What I can do is load the database, 10,000 reps of one specific door, one specific problem, until the search comes back in 100 milliseconds with an answer already attached to your hands. The pause stays. The pause is fine. What changes is what's on the other side of it. And if it comes back empty again, then it comes back empty and you die same as anybody. She said it flatly because he was a medic and he would smell a lie instantly. But it won't, because I'm going to run you through that doorway until you're sick of it and you're going to hate me. And in 5 weeks, you'll be in a building somewhere and your hands are going to move and you won't even remember deciding. Teague stood there for a long moment. Gunny, can I ask why you're doing this at 0200 instead of writing me up? And Wren Callahan, who had a redacted personnel NX in her locker and a name on it, said the truest thing she could say without saying the whole thing. Because somebody in that valley made a decision that cost them everything so that you'd get to be standing here. And I'm not going to let the last thing that comes out of that valley be you deciding you're broken. I didn't ask how she knew there was a valley. Later, she'd realized that was the moment she should have understood how close the whole thing already was to the surface. At 1400 the next day, Nadia Ruiz stood at the front of a classroom of 30 men and taught structural loading and standoff distance for 55 minutes. She was terrible for the first 4 minutes. Her voice was too fast and pitched too high, and she read the first slide instead of teaching it, and Wren stood in the back and made herself do nothing, absolutely nothing. Because the single worst thing she could have done for that woman's career was rescue her in front of 30 men. Then a Marine gunnery sergeant named Aldrey, 38, quiet the senior Marine in the platoon, and a man who had said maybe 40 words in 9 days, asked a real question. Not a gotcha. A real one about wall composition and whether the standoff numbers held for reinforced masonry versus what they'd actually encounter in a city that had been building with whatever was cheap for 30 years. And Nadia Ruiz stopped reading the slide. She answered it for 6 minutes. She drew on the board. She corrected an assumption 3 of them were carrying gently without making anyone stupid. She used the phrase, and this is where you'll get hurt, twice, and both times the room got very quiet because she said it like a person who had watched it happen. When the block ended, 4 men came up to the front with follow-up questions, and one of them was a SEAL. And Wren watched a 25-year-old woman who had eaten alone for 4 months stand in the middle of a small crowd of men who wanted something from her professionally and had to look at the ceiling for a second. That night, Ruiz found her outside and did not have her chin up defiantly for once and said, Gunny, they listened. They listened because you knew it. I just moved you to the front of the room. No. Ruiz shook her head and her ponytail had come loose again, the way it always did by evening, and she looked all of about 19. No, respectfully, that's not what happened, and I need you to hear the actual thing. Her voice went rough. For 4 months, I've been trying to be so good that they'd have to notice. And it doesn't work, Gunny. It never works. Being good is invisible. You have to be put somewhere. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye, hard, furious with herself. You put me somewhere. Nobody's ever done that before. Then do it for the next one. There isn't a next one. There's always a next one, Wren said. You're just usually too busy surviving to see her. The thing with Boone happened on the 11th day, and it happened in the chow hall, and it happened because Boone was 26 and had been chewed on for 4 days about the shoot house and needed somewhere to put it. He put it on Ruiz. He did it the way it's always done, not to her, near her. A comment to a table about how the course had gotten pretty comfortable with letting people teach blocks. They'd never have gotten in front of a room for anywhere else, and how you could always tell when a program had a quota to fill, and a couple of laughs that were more nervous than agreeing. Ruiz kept eating. 4 months of practice. She didn't even look up. Wren was 11 feet away with a tray in her hands and about a half second to decide what kind of instructor she was going to be for the remaining 10 days. She set the tray down on Boone's table. Petty Officer Boone, you've got a question about instructor qualifications. I'd rather you ask it where I can answer it. The chow hall did that thing rooms do. Boone's throat moved. No question, Gunny. You've got one. You've had one for 4 days since a man in your stack stopped in a doorway and you decided it was easier to be loud than to be curious about it. She let that land and she watched the color go out of his face because he had absolutely not expected her to bring up the shoot house in front of everyone. So here's your options, and there's only 2, and I'm not going to make either of them humiliating for you. Option 1, you finish your dinner and tomorrow you show up and you outwork Petty Officer Ruiz on the breaching lane. And if you can, everybody sees it and you've made your point, honestly. Option 2, you step outside with me right now, and I'll give you the same 4 seconds I gave your senior chief. Somebody's fork hit a tray. Boone looked involuntarily at Kovac, and Roman Kovac, sitting 6 feet away, did not look up from his food and said in a voice that carried perfectly, "Don't look at me, Boone. I'm still trying to figure out what she did to my arm." 9 days of dead air, and that was the first time the compound heard the senior chief concede anything out loud, and Wren felt the whole room move about half a degree. Boone took option 1. He got beaten on the breaching lane the next morning by 4 seconds and had the decency to say so. And by the end of the week, he was asking Ruiz about charge geometry like it had never occurred to him not to. That was the good day. Wren has thought about that afterward, that there was exactly one good day in the middle of it, and that she didn't recognize it at the time. Marchetti taught the mid-course hour on the 13th day, and he did not use slides. He told them he was 29 years old in October of 1983, and that at 06:22 he had been complaining about coffee. He told them what a building sounds like when 19,000 pounds of explosive removes the ground floor of it, that it isn't a bang, that a bang is a small thing, that what it actually is silence with a sound wrapped around it. He told them he spent 9 days in that rubble, and that the number they'd all read in a book, 241, was not a number to him, but a sequence, and that he could still put a name to most of the sequence. Then he told them the only part that mattered. Every system built to help us that morning failed. Every one. Comms failed. The chain of command failed for the first 90 minutes because most of it was under the concrete. Medical support was inside the building. That was the emergency. Air ordnance doctrine, the whole apparatus gone in under 4 seconds. He let it sit. So what was left, gentlemen, was 20-year-olds with their hands. That's what did the work for 9 days. Hands and whatever was already inside their heads before 0622. He put his palms flat on the table. In 6 weeks, a lot of you will be inside buildings in a city with people you did not train with on a net you don't trust. And I want to tell you something that Gunnery Sergeant Callahan is too professional to say to you directly. He looked at Kovac when he said the next part, and the whole room noticed. There is a version of the next 3 weeks where you all execute this course beautifully and learn absolutely nothing. That version is available. It is easy. And when your comms drop, that version will kill people who trusted you. Nobody in the room breathed for a second. Then Marchetti straightened and delivered the administrative note, and the administrative note was the thing that changed everything. Final matter, board composition for day 21. The Joint Warfare Assessment Group has designated the senior member. He read it off a page. Colonel Warren Doss, United States Marine Corps. 2 people in that room reacted, and neither of them moved a muscle. The first was Roman Kovac, and what Wren saw when she looked at him was not surprise. It was the face of a man watching something arrive that he had been expecting for 11 months. The second was Wren herself, and what went through her was so cold and so complete that she had to put her hand flat against the wall behind her. Because she had spent 11 months with 41 pages of black, and on page 1 of those pages in the release authority block, under the line that said, "Reviewed and approved for classification," there was a signature she could have drawn from memory. Warren Doss. The man coming to grade her course was the man who had sealed her brother's death. She did not sleep that night. She did something worse, which was work. The compound kept an archived communications log. Every training center did a rolling record of net traffic for the range control frequencies maintained for safety and liability, and dumped every 90 days. But the center also held archival copies of operational net summaries for units that had staged through it, because units staged through it constantly and the paperwork accreted. She had no authority to pull an operational summary from a mission in Afghanistan. She had authority to pull anything at all with a training nexus, and Kovac's element had staged through this compound for pre-deployment workup in January of 2002, and units that stage through a center leave a trail of timestamps behind them, like footprints, readiness rosters, medical clearances, comms plans, frequency assignments. At 0140, she found the comms plan. At 0210, she found something that made her stop breathing properly. It was a nothing document, a routine post-operation communication summary, unclassified 3 pages, the kind of administrative dross that gets filed because a regulation says file it and never read by a human being again. It listed net traffic volume by hour for the supporting element during the operational window in March. Not content, just volume, just a column of numbers. And the column had a hole in it. From 350 to 0431, the log recorded 0 transmissions on the primary tactical net for that element. Ren sat very still. 41 minutes of nothing. On a night when a 9-man element was in contact taking casualties, moving down a goat trail with a man behind them holding a door. She pulled the 41 redacted pages out of her locker and put them beside it. The after-action report the version DOS had reviewed and approved placed the loss of Staff Sergeant Eli Callahan at 0338 and stated that the element had broken contact and commenced exfiltration at 0341 and that the extraction was completed without further enemy engagement. By that timeline, the net should have been busy from 0341 onward. Movement calls, casualty updates, coordination with the extraction platform. A 9-man element carrying 2 wounded down a mountain in the dark generates constant traffic. It was the loudest possible 41 minutes a radio could have. Instead, the log said the net was silent from 0350 to 0431, which meant one of 2 things. Either 9 men had moved down an Afghan mountain with 2 casualties and absolute radio discipline for 41 straight minutes for no reason anybody could name, or the traffic existed, and it had been pulled out of the record, and the report had been written around the hole afterward. Ren went back to page 11 of the redacted report and read the narrative fragment that survived the black bars, the one she had read maybe 60 times, at which point the element leader requested guidance regarding, and then 3 inches of black, and then. The request was addressed at the appropriate command echelon. The request was addressed, not approved, not denied, addressed. She had read that sentence 60 times, and it had never once occurred to her to ask what happens to a sentence when you remove the verb. At 0248, Ren Callahan understood something about her brother's death that 11 months of grief had never gotten close to. She had spent all that time asking how Eli died. She had assumed it was a tactical question, bad intel, bad ground, a jammed weapon, the ordinary arithmetic of a bad night in a bad valley. She had wanted to know so that it would make sense, because that was what she did with everything. Take it apart until the mechanism showed. But nobody redacts a mechanism. You redact a decision. Somewhere in those 41 silent minutes, a man had asked a question on an open net, and somebody at an appropriate command echelon had answered it, and 11 months later, the record of both existed as a column of zeros and a sentence with the verb removed and a signature on page 1, belonging to a colonel who would be standing in this compound in 8 days. She put both documents down. And then, because she was who she was, she went one step further, and she pulled the personnel annex again and looked at the 9 names, and she thought about a senior chief who had filed a written objection 11 days before she arrived, giving a doctrinal reason that was a lie. He hadn't been trying to avoid her. He'd been trying to avoid being in the same room as her when Warren Doss walked into it. 80331. She stood in the compound and did the arithmetic on 8 remaining days, 30 men an assessment board, and the fact that the only living human being who could tell her what happened in those 41 minutes was a man she had put on wet concrete on the first morning and had not spoken a single unnecessary word to since. She was still standing there at 0345 when the first of them came out for formation, and Roman Kovac was among them. And he looked at her, and something in her face must have finally slipped because he stopped walking. For 3 full seconds in the dark, neither of them said anything. Then Ren turned to the formation and gave the order for the surf run in a voice with absolutely nothing in it, and 30 men went to work, and Kovac went with them. She waited until they were gone. Then she went back inside and she pulled the file for the culminating field exercise, 72 hours, 9 square miles, 30 operators against 2 instructors. And she looked at the maintenance annex for the training structures they'd be using, and she started reading it line by line because she had just learned in the most expensive possible way what happens to people when nobody bothers to read the boring pages. Hy didn't argue. He held it in his good hand for a second, and then he did something Ren wasn't ready for. He came to attention, one-armed in a sling in a passageway, with nobody watching, and held a salute until she returned it. Then he said, "There's 28 guys in that classroom who don't know what to do with themselves right now. Gunny and I'm not the one who can talk to them." "Why not?" "Because they just watched me cry," Kovac said. 3 weeks of me being a wall, and they watch the wall come down. And if I go in there now, the only thing they'll learn is that it hurts. You go, you tell them what it's for. Graduation was on the 24th on a cold morning, and the compound was still full of people with clipboards because a collapsed structure generates paperwork for months. 29 of them formed up. Ruiz was the 30th, and Ruiz was at Portsmouth with an external fixator on her right femur and a surgeon who had used the phrase "she'll run again" out loud in front of a witness, which Wren had made him repeat. She stood in front of them for the last time, and she did not give a speech about legacy. She gave them their evaluation scores. All of them out loud by name, good and bad, because she had promised on day one that nothing in that compound would be decided in a room they weren't in. She told Boone his breaching times were the most improved in the course, and that he had gotten there by being told the truth in a chow hall and having the decency to take it. She told Aldrich he was the best small unit leader she had worked with in 11 years, and that she intended to say so in writing to people who could do something about it. And she gave the top mark in casualty response to Petty Officer Second Class Micah Teague, and 28 men made a noise that wasn't military at all. He came up after, and he had a folded piece of paper in his hand, not the casualty card. Something else. Gunny, I opened it. Opened what? The Christmas card. His throat worked. It's from a guy at Bragg named Dellinger. He's got a kid. It's a girl. She's 8 months. Her name's... He stopped and had to restart. Her name's Ellie. He didn't know Eli's name. He was unconscious the whole way down that mountain. He just knew somebody stayed. Wren couldn't say anything for a second. Gunny, I need to tell you something, and then I'm going to go stand back in formation. Teague's hands were shaking, and he let them. Everybody in there thinks you fixed me. They think you made me brave. You didn't. I was scared the whole time I was under that slab the entire 19 minutes. I was so scared I could taste it. He looked up. You didn't make me brave. You just gave my hands something to do while I was afraid. That's all it ever was. And nobody in 24 years had ever thought to do that. He saluted badly, because medics always do. Then he went and stood back in formation, third from the left, and Wren noticed, because she noticed everything, because it was the only skill she had that had never once failed her, that for the first time in 24 days, Micah Teague was standing at the end of the rank, where the door would be. Kovac's element rotated out on the 28th, the Marine platoon on the 2nd of March. Wren shook hands with 29 people over 5 days, and every one of them said some version of the same thing badly, and she let them. Aldrich was the last one out the gate, and he stopped his vehicle and got out and stood there with his hand on the door. Gunny, can I ask you something that's none of my business? Probably. You knew who Kovac was the first night. You had that roster on day one. Aldrich squinted at her. 19 days you looked that man in the face and said nothing. How? Wren thought about it honestly, because he deserved honest. Because for 11 months I wanted somebody to be guilty, she said. That's the truth. I wanted a name, and I had one on day one, and it would have felt so good to use it. She shrugged. And 30 men needed to go to a war in 6 weeks. Those were the 2 things on the scale, Gunnery Sergeant. It wasn't a hard decision. It was just an expensive one. That's the whole course, isn't it? What is that? He got back in the vehicle. Whatever that is, that's what you were teaching the whole time, and none of us knew it. They went in on the 20th of March. Wren was at Quantico by then in a schoolhouse building the expanded program of instruction with a staff of 4 and a budget that was for the first time in the history of joint integration training actually funded. She wrote curriculum 11 hours a day and watched a war on a television in a break room with everybody else, and understood in a way that made her physically ill that the people she had spent 24 days shouting at were inside it. The first message came on the 11th of April from a Navy staff sergeant she'd never met, forwarded 3 times, and it was 4 lines long. Kovac's element had been in a building in a city in the south, with the comms down, genuinely down, not degraded, the repeater gone, and the handheld screaming static in a stairwell that turned back on itself twice, with a jam-fed weapon at the top of it. 9 men, no lights, voice in hand and angle, and a Marine squad they had never worked with a day in their lives, except for 24 days in Virginia in January. They came out with 9. The message ended, Senior Chief says, to tell you the stairwell was building 4 with better weather. Wren read it in a break room at Quantico and had to go stand in a passageway. The second message came in July from Teague, and it was longer and worse. Oni had worked a casualty collection point for 19 hours in a place he wasn't allowed to name, and it had gone bad in the way those things go bad. And at some point, he had made a decision about who got worked first that he was going to carry for the rest of his life. He did not freeze. Not once. He wrote that flatly in the middle of a paragraph like it was a data point instead of the entire thing. But what he wrote at the end was this: Gunny, I'm not okay. I want to say that to you because you're the only person I've ever said a true thing to. I did and I did it right, and I'm still not okay, and I don't think that's a failure anymore. I think that's just the bill. You told me the pause stays. Turns out the rest of it stays too. I'm getting help. I got help before I got home, which I understand is rare, and the only reason I asked for it is that a woman in the rain told 30 guys out loud that the pause isn't cowardice, and 11 of us needed to hear it, and only one of us admitted it. Rin wrote back the same day, and she never told anybody what she wrote. Nadia Ruiz called her in October. She was walking. She had spent 5 months in rehab being told by 3 separate people that a shattered femur with that much hardware in it was an out, that she could take a medical board and a rating and go home with her dignity, and she had said no 3 times. They keep offering me the door, Gunny, she said, and I keep telling them I already went out one door under 11 tons of concrete and I didn't care for it. Ren laughed so hard she had to sit down. Ruiz passed her physical readiness screen in January, 11 months after the collapse, and in March she was assigned as an instructor at her own school, as first woman ever to teach that block. And the first thing she did on the first day of her first class was something that she called Ren afterward to confess to sounding about 19. I put a kid at the front of the room, she said. First class, there's a girl in it, third class petty officer. She's 22. She's the only one. And Gunny, she's good. She's better at charge geometry than half of them. And she's been sitting in the back, making herself small for 6 weeks, and I know exactly what she's doing because I did it for 4 months. So what did you do? I made her teach standoff distance. Ruiz's voice cracked. In front of everybody. Day 1. And she was awful for 4 minutes, and then somebody asked her a real question, and she stopped reading the slide. She stopped reading the slide. Neither of them said anything for a second. You told me there's always a next one, Ruiz said. I thought you were being nice. You weren't being nice. It's just true. There's always a next one, and you're the only one who can see her because you were her. The Inspector General's report on the March 2002 operation was released in a redacted form in November and then in a much less redacted form the following spring, and it ran to 211 pages. Ren read all of it. Warren Doss had not been protecting an operation. That was the finding, and it was the finding she had already known in her bones in a dark room with headphones on. He had been protecting an architecture, a joint command arrangement that he had personally designed and personally briefed as a model in which tactical elements from different services operating together did not have organic authority to divert for cross-service casualties without approval from a combined echelon, because in the design document, which was appended to the report as Exhibit F, that authority was described as a control measure against mission dilution. Mission dilution. The phrase appeared 4 times in a document Doss had written, and once in March of 2002, it had been the reason a man on a ridge had to ask permission 4 times in 90 seconds to go back for a Marine. The report found that Eli Callahan's death was not attributable to any tactical error by any individual. It found that Senior Chief Roman Kovac had complied with a lawful order and had reported the circumstances accurately and in writing within 4 days, and that his statement had been received, logged, and then not incorporated, and that the decision not to incorporate it was made at the level of the reviewing authority. And it found in one paragraph on page 184 in the flat, unglamorous language those documents use, that the communication summary submitted with the after-action report contained a 41-minute gap that did not correspond to any known transmission failure. Nobody went to prison. That is the part Ren tells people when they ask, because they always want to know, and they are always disappointed. Warren Doss retired at a reduced grade with an adverse characterization in his file, and a pension in the architecture he designed was rewritten in 11 pages that took effect in the fall of 2004, and the 11 pages are the entire reason that any of it mattered. The revised authority reads in part that an on-scene commander may divert to recover or support a casualty of any service without prior approval, and that the requirement to request such approval is removed. They did not name it after anybody. Military documents don't do that. But the working group that drafted it took testimony from 4 people, and one of them was a senior chief with a scar on his forearm who flew in from a deployment workup on his own leave to sit in a room in Virginia for 6 hours and answer questions about 90 seconds in a valley. And the transcript of that testimony is 40 pages long. And at the end of it, when the recorder asked if he had anything to add, Roman Kovac said this: "Yeah, the Marine on that net told me it wasn't my fault before he died. I want that in the record because he took his last 4 seconds to do it, and I've spent 2 years trying to be worth it. Somebody should have to read that before they ever write another sentence that makes a man ask permission." She went home in the summer of 2004 and sat with her mother on a porch in North Carolina for 4 days and did almost nothing. On the 3rd day, her mother brought out a shoebox, and in it, under a folded flag she had not looked at in 2 years, was a page in Eli's handwriting. A letter he had started in Kandahar and never finished, addressed to nobody, the kind of thing men write at 2 in the morning and then don't send. It was 11 lines long, and most of it was about socks. But at the bottom, he had written, "Ren's gonna do 20 years and she doesn't know it yet. She thinks she's doing this because of me. She's going to figure out at some point that she'd have done it anyway. And I hope it doesn't take her too long because she's got work to do." Ren sat on that porch with the page in her hand for a long time. Her mother said, "You've been angry for 2 years, honey." "I know. Are you still?" And Ren Callaghan, 33 years old, gave the only honest answer she had. "No," she said. "I was angry because I thought he died for nothing. And it turns out he didn't die for nothing. He died for 4 guys on a goat trail, and one of them's got a daughter named Ellie. And the last thing he did with his life was make sure the man who left him could live with it." Her voice went, "Mom, I spent 2 years trying to find out how he died. I never once asked what he was doing while he died. It was the same thing he'd every single day. He was taking care of people. It just happened to be the last 4 seconds instead of the middle of a Tuesday." In September of 2005, she was standing in front of 60 faces in a classroom at Quantico on the first morning of the expanded course, Marines and sailors, and for the first time 4 Army Rangers, because the program had gotten out of the Navy's hands entirely, and nobody was trying to put it back. 14 of the 60 were women. She counted every year, and she was never going to stop counting. She had a course patch on her sleeve that 29 people had paid for out of pocket in February of 2003, and there was no knife on her hip, and there had not been for 2.5 years, and the absence of it was the single most comfortable thing she owned. And in the front row, 11 minutes into the first period of instruction, a sergeant who was about 26 and built like a door leaned back in his chair and said the thing. "Ma'am, respectfully, what's a hand-to-hand instructor going to teach guys who've already been over there?" The room got very still because about a third of that room had heard the story, and a third of that third had heard it from somebody who was there. Ren didn't get annoyed. She had genuinely never once been annoyed by that question, which was something almost nobody believed about her. "That's a fair question," she said. "And I'm going to give you the same courtesy I gave the last man who asked it because he deserved it, and so do you. Ma'am, you can sit down right now and lose nothing, not one thing. Nobody in this room will think less of you, and I'll answer your question with words, and we'll spend 12 weeks working, and you'll be very good at the end of it." She set down her pen. "I don't enjoy this part. I've done it 111 times, and I've never enjoyed it once, and I'm not being modest, it's just true." The sergeant grinned. But don't make me prove it," Ren said. "Because once I do, you don't get to unknow it." And neither did they. He stood up. They always stand up. In 11 years, in 111 classrooms, not one man had ever sat down, and she had made peace with that a long time ago. Because it wasn't stubbornness. It was just what young people do when something in the world doesn't match the shape they've been handed. And honestly, she thought, thank God for it. It took 4 seconds. He got up off the mat with the specific expression she had seen 111 times, and she gave him back his dignity the way she always did, which was by immediately explaining exactly what she had done to him and why it worked and how to do it to somebody else, because she had learned in a rainstorm in Virginia in January of 2003 that a technique you can't explain is a technique that dies with you. Then she turned to 60 faces and taught the first period, and the first period was not about the mat. Everything after this is repetitions, she told him. 10,000 of them, and you're going to hate me by week 4, and I'm going to be fine with that. But I want you to know on day 1 what the repetitions are actually for, because if you don't know, you'll do them wrong. She walked to the front of the room. They are not so you can win. Some of you will not win. They are not so you'll be brave. I can't give you that, and neither can anybody else. And the bravest person I ever met was a 24-year-old kid who was terrified for 19 straight minutes and went in anyway. She paused. You build the hands so that when the worst thing happens, when the comms are gone and the building's coming down and there's nothing left but what's already in you, you're not standing there solving a problem. Your hands are already solving it. 60 people were completely silent. And that buys you 1 second. And in that 1 second, you get to think about somebody other than yourself. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in a classroom in 2.5 years. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. Everything I'm going to teach you for 12 weeks exists to buy you 1 second to be a decent human being in. A hand went up in the third row. A Corporal 19 maybe, who looked like she'd been holding the question since the mat. Ma'am, is it true the thing about the tape? Wren had known that question was coming from the moment she'd read the roster. She'd known it was coming for 2 years. My brother was Staff Sergeant Eli Callahan, she said. He held a breach point in Afghanistan in March of 2002 with a weapon that wouldn't cycle so that 4 men could carry 2 casualties down a trail. It cost him his life, and it took me 2 years to understand that it didn't cost him anything at all because he wasn't paying for something. He was doing his job. The last 4 seconds of it, he spent making sure the man who had to leave him wouldn't spend the rest of his life hating himself for it. The room did not move. That is not a story about how he died, Wren said. I want to be extremely clear with all 60 of you because I got it wrong for 2 years, and I don't want you getting it wrong or 2 minutes. That's a story about what he did with the 1 second his training bought him. He had 100 things he could have said, and he used it on somebody else. That's not heroism. That's not a movie. That's a man whose hands were so well trained that his mind was free. She picked her pen back up. So no, Corporal, I can't teach you courage, and I can't teach you experience, but I can teach you to build hands good enough that when it's your 4 seconds, you get to spend them on somebody else. She looked at 60 faces, Marines and sailors and Rangers, 14 of them women. One of them in the third row who was going to teach this exact block in a schoolhouse in 11 years and start it with this exact story. That's the whole curriculum, Wren Callahan said. Let's begin. She never did find out what Eli's last unfinished sentence was going to be. She stopped needing to. The door held. It is still holding. And every 12 weeks, 60 more people learn how to hold it.